Well, this story is about a ship, Medusa, which shipwrecked just over 200 years ago off the coast of Africa. You're about to discover how a series of errors, stupidity, and bad luck led to one of the most senseless, yet tragic maritime disasters in history. A human tragedy that makes the Titanic look insignificant in comparison. What happened aboard Medusa was so inhuman that both literature and cinema have largely stayed silent. Only art, with Géricault's immortal painting, managed to capture this shipwreck and elevate it to the level of a myth. So, to start this story, let me take you aboard the Raft, well, I mean aboard the painting. We are in 1819. After 2 years of relentless work tonight, Théodore Géricault is putting the final touches on his masterpiece, a massive painting. It's 5 meters tall and 7 meters wide. Géricault even had to move out of his small studio on Rue des Martyrs to find a more suitable space in Paris for this enormous canvas. The subject is serious. It depicts a shipwreck that shocked the world 3 years earlier in 1816, the wreck of a French naval vessel named Medusa. But to avoid controversy with the French government, the artist gave it the understated title, A Shipwreck Scene. However, everyone knew it was a fierce indictment of the incompetence of certain ministers and naval officials. The year 1819 would go on to be the year of Géricault's triumph. A triumph due to his incredible talent, of course, but also because of the political undertones in his painting. If you ever get the chance to visit the Louvre, stand in front of the painting. The raft and the figures are nearly life-sized. You'll feel like you're there with them, adrift at sea. In the foreground, exhausted men after 13 days of drifting pile on top of others who have already died. In the center, you'll see men with feverish eyes, filled with hope. Some are still managing to stand. One, an African man, raised by his fellow survivors, is waving a piece of cloth. He spots a ship in the distance, the Argus. Hope is revived aboard the raft, but the survivors don't know if the Argus has seen them or if they will be rescued. This is Géricault's painting. Death, hope, suspense. I believe that's what we call a masterpiece. The government decided to send new settlers there, and a ship, the famous Medusa, would leave from Ile d'Aix to transport 392 people. On board were the family of the new governor, Schmaltz, administrators, soldiers from the Senegal battalion, scientists and others. The goal was to re-establish the colony and reclaim Senegal, which had temporarily fallen under British control. The journey was supposed to take no more than 3 weeks. And since Medusa entered service 6 years earlier in 1810, it had always performed well. It was a beautiful ship, 74 meters long and 12 meters wide, armed with 44 cannons. It hadn't sailed much, but it had traveled to the Indies and the Caribbean. In 1815, it was even selected to transport the defeated Napoleon to America. But, as you know, at the last moment, the British, those traitors, intercepted him, making them forever guilty in the eyes of history. On June 17, 1816, under clear skies, a fleet of 4 ships set sail. Medusa was accompanied by 3 other vessels, l'Echo, l'Argus, and la Loire. Initially, everything went smoothly for the 3 other ships, but concerns quickly arose aboard Medusa. The problem was the captain. Yes, he's the main character in our story, and you'll notice I'm carefully avoiding calling him a hero. The captain's name was Hugues du Roy de Chaumaret. He began by greeting his crew with an unsettling phrase, "You will be my children and I will be your father." Not exactly the typical speech of a seasoned sailor, and very soon the officers accompanying him realized there was a major issue. He didn't know or understand anything about navigation, absolutely nothing, yet he was the captain. Yes, it's a clear case of Houston, we have a problem. The rest of the crew started to question his credentials. In fact, Chaumaret hadn't set foot on a ship in 25 years. Why? Because his fervent royalism had cost him a command in the Navy during the Revolution and the Empire. He was completely out of practice. Worse still, he had never really had the experience. The only ship he had ever commanded, L'Aigrette, had never left the port of Brest. So, how did he become captain? Through connections, of course. It's always about who you know. Being friends with the king's brother has its perks. And so, at 53 years old, because positions had to be given to loyal monarchists, they handed over one of the French Navy's principal warships to a complete incompetent. And this captain, he made nothing but bad decisions. For example, the instructions were clear. All 4 ships had to sail together, but Chaumaret decided to go off on his own, heading much too far east. Soon his escort disappeared into the distance. Why this decision? Even though his officers warned him, "Captain, if we continue on this course, we'll run aground on the Banc d'Argent. And trust me, the Banc d'Argent isn't some friendly beach. It's the terror of all sailors navigating the coast of Mauritania. It's a vast sandbank, invisible at high tide, that must be avoided by measuring the ocean depth with ropes. And the officers who were measuring knew they were no longer in open water. They were dangerously close to the sandbank. But our captain, proud of being an officer of the old regime, was sure of himself. He claimed they had already passed the Banc d'Argent. No problem, he thought, even though everyone explained otherwise, and the fact that the other 3 ships had taken a completely different course should have been a clear sign. But no. And to those who begged him to change course, he responded with, "Set the sails." And so, with everything seemingly under control on his outdated maps, which were more than 60 years old, what happened next was entirely predictable. On July 2nd, 1816, at around 3 p.m., Medusa struck the Banc d'Argent twice before becoming completely stuck. Despite the crew's best efforts to free the ship, it was no use. 2 days later, the rudder broke, and Medusa tilted dangerously. At dawn, Captain Chaumareys made another disastrous decision. He ordered the evacuation of the ship. Another mistake. Medusa was stuck in the sand. It wasn't sinking. They could have simply sent a few men to the coast for help, but no. The captain decided to abandon ship, but where exactly would everyone go? The frigate only had 6 lifeboats. So, 147 men were crammed onto a hastily constructed raft, measuring 20 meters by 7. The lifeboats were supposed to tow the raft, which weighed around 20 tons. But after 3 days, when the captain realized the raft was too heavy to be pulled, he made a terrible decision. He ordered the ropes to be cut. Yes, the captain and those in the lifeboats abandoned 147 sailors at sea on their makeshift raft. Feeling abandoned to their tragic fate, some men, overcome with despair, immediately jumped into the water. It was perhaps a better fate than what awaited the others. While the lifeboats reached the coast safely and the passengers survived, the raft of Medusa continued to drift. The Argus, L'Echo and La Loire had already arrived safely at port several days earlier. Meanwhile, on the raft, the first night was marked by a violent storm. By dawn, 20 men had already been swept away by the waves. As for supplies, there was only a single bag of waterlogged biscuits and a small ration of wine. We know this story well, thanks to the accounts of 2 survivors who were on the raft. They shared their experiences in a book that was difficult to believe at the time. These 2 men were Alexandre Coreard, a cartographer, and Jean-Baptiste Savigny, an assistant surgeon. Thanks to their testimony, we know that on the second night, a mutiny broke out among the soldiers, which the officers violently repressed. The toll, more than 80 dead. And you might say, well, that's fewer mouths to feed given the meager food supply. By the 3rd day of drifting, we reached the point where it's best to shield the children from the story. Acts of cannibalism began. But why so soon on the 3rd day? We know a person can survive without food or water for nearly 10 days. The answer is simple. Madness had taken hold of the men. These men, soaked to the bone by salt water, burned by the sun, and tossed about by the waves, had completely lost their minds. Savigny writes, "The unfortunate souls who had escaped death threw themselves greedily onto the corpses, slicing them into pieces and devouring them immediately. Some of the most desperate men even chewed on leather belts, straps, and any remaining fabric they could find. By the morning of the 5th day, only 30 men were left alive, with 10 of them lying on the deck of the raft, suffering from wounds, burns, and saltwater sores." On the morning of July 17th, Captain Dupont, who was now in command of the raft, spotted a ship on the horizon, 3 leagues away. Immediately a sailor climbed to the top of the mast and waved a piece of cloth, but the ship disappeared. This is the scene that Géricault captures in his painting. At that moment, the survivors' despair was at its peak, but later that morning the ship reappeared. This time, they had been seen. The survivors were too weak to celebrate, but they were saved. After 13 days adrift, only 15 survivors were found, 15 out of the 147 who had boarded the raft. And this is where the true scandal unfolds. You might think, like me, that the Argus had been patrolling the seas, searching for the lost men. Well, not at all. In fact, when Captain Chaumareys, freshly recovered from the ordeal, sent the Argus back out to sea, it wasn't to rescue the survivors. It was to retrieve the money and valuable items left aboard Medusa. Oh, and by the way, 17 men had made the choice to stay aboard Medusa and wait for rescue. Only 3 of them survived, and we can only imagine what they endured on the deserted ship. For Captain Chaumares, rescuing the men from the raft was not a good idea. These men might talk, they might reveal the truth about what had happened, and once they recovered, that's exactly what they did. As soon as they were well enough, Corriard and Savigny began writing down their accounts. Meanwhile, Captain Chaumares and the governor of Senegal sent heavily edited reports to their respective ministers. But even back then, news traveled fast. On September 2, 1816, the ship L'Echo docked in Brest, and just a few days later, the Journal des Débats published the full story of the shipwreck. The scandal erupted immediately. The affair became political. The government was accused of appointing officials based on loyalty to the monarchy rather than competence, and for many French people, the wreck of Medusa became an allegory for the impending collapse of the Kingdom of France. Before I leave you, I have one last thing to say about the fate of Captain Chaumares. Brace yourselves. He was of course put on trial. His military court-martial began in February 1817, just 7 months after the disaster. He was charged with the loss of his ship, the abandonment of the raft, and the disbanding of the Senegal division, quite a list of offenses. Found entirely responsible for the events, he was stripped of his rank in the Navy and sentenced to just 3 years in prison. A relatively light punishment, considering he could have been sentenced to death. They also took away his medals, both the Legion of Honor and the Order of St. Louis. Now I'll let you guess what Captain Chaumares did for the rest of his life. He lived for another 25 years after the wreck. During that time, he never stopped sending letters to King Louis XVIII, Charles X, and Louis Philippe, demanding that his medals be returned, insisting that he had been unfairly stripped of them. Incompetence, stupidity, and arrogance all wrapped up in one man. And that, my friends, is why no French ship has ever again been named Medusa.